Welcome to Nightmares and Grief, a place to explore and celebrate the darkness. Each episode, I'll read stories written by me, Derrick Heisey. So settle in, check under the bed, and pour a drink for the skeletons in your closet. It's time to start. The Weather Vane. The heat rolled in like an unexpected relative, familiar but unwanted. Eastern Washington had a ludicrous heat wave around this time in the summer for 2 weeks every year, but its suddenness always took my family and me by surprise. I'd sat at the kitchen table that morning with coffee and a yellow legal pad, making a list of chores to do, but the list soon overwhelmed me. Ryan always helped me with the farm. Little things like checking the trellises or training the hop vines, sometimes weeding, and although I usually had to go in after him to fix his work, help was help. It was just too much to do alone, and it was too hot, and thoughts swarmed inside my head like a hornet's nest. Chores could wait. I never liked them anyway, and I was no good right now. I got my fishing things along with the book I'd gotten at Jessica's store, a fat volume about King Tutankhamun she'd slipped her number into, and I headed out. My favorite fishing spot was along the little river behind the farmhouse. There was a big rock underneath a tree so broad that no matter what time of day it was, the rock was always shady. It was insulated enough from the main road that even those occasional trucks that passed by were muted by the woods. It was just the water, the birds, the sunlight, and me. I'd brought the old wicker creel that my father had gotten my brother for his 12th birthday. It had his name woven into the side. I'd always been jealous of that wicker creel. I coveted it most when it sat unused in his closet. On Ryan's 18th birthday, my parents gave him an insulated creel bag, and the wicker basket was forgotten. He'd died a week before. Fell off the roof and hit his head on a rock while we were fixing the weather vane. We just had the funeral, and the emotion still moved in my heart like a restless snake full of muscle and venom. I cast a line out and sat down, trying to let the serenity ease my mind. It only took a minute or so before I got a bite. I pulled and reeled it in until the glistening, iridescent body of a rainbow trout flapped out of the water, bringing the sparkling beads of glistening water with it. With a cheer and a laugh, I reeled the sucker in. I cut the trout's throat with a triumphant smile on my face and placed it into the creel. Let's see Ryan catch a fish that fast. I had to stop myself there. The memory of the funeral hit me in the gut. I turned to look back at the house. Even at this distance, I could just make out the weather vane. The wind had blown the old thing so hard that it almost ripped out of the roof. It stood crooked on the slanted roof, the spear-like fleur-de-lis at its top pointing up and back. We never did get to fix it. I could blame that weather vane for Ryan's death. Maybe that might make me feel better. The line plunked into the river again, and it wasn't as quick this time, but sure enough, I snagged a big one. I struggled against the fish, pulling the rod against its fight, talking smack as I reeled it in. What emerged from the water was one of the biggest trout I'd ever seen in my life. I was worried it'd break my line before I could get it ashore, but I reeled as fast as I could, muttering, come on, as I brought it closer and closer. It bounced on the line, but I got it close enough that I could hold out the net and snag the sucker. It was easily 30 inches. The catch let me forget my grief for a moment as the hole it left behind was filled with pride. Ryan had never caught a fish that big before. I struggled with it while slitting its throat, but I managed to hold it down while the life left its strong body. Something glinted inside the cut. Reaching inside, I yanked out a locket. It was a big fish, but even something that big would have had a hard time swallowing a locket. It was beautiful, shiny and golden with intricate lines like a roller coaster carved into it. It appeared to be in perfect condition, not a scratch on it, but that was deceptive because it wouldn't open. The hinges must have fused together from its time in the water. I lodged the edge of the fishing knife into the opening and tried to pry it apart. It was sealed tight. I wiggled the knife back and forth, but I pushed too hard and my hands were slippery from the water and the fish. The knife slipped. I sliced my hand open. Blood gushed onto the locket, and it fell from my hands. I swore louder than I'd intended and wrapped my hand with a handkerchief from the creel. When I turned back around to the locket, it lay open on the rock. I reached down to pick it up. A picture of my mother looked back at me. I'm not ashamed to admit I fell backwards onto my backside staring at that picture. Of all the improbabilities, that my mother would lose a locket in my river, that a trout would find that locket and eat it, and that I would catch that fish years after her death. It made my head spin. I kissed the locket and put it in my pocket. Maybe it was a sign from her. Maybe she'd come to me in my hour of need to tell me everything was going to be all right. What a day. I went home after that. Couldn't do much fishing with my hand bandaged like that, so I went back to the house to dress it proper. I fixed it up and then decided I might as well tackle that to-do list. It wasn't going to get any shorter without my help. I stuck to easier things like training the vines and working on the trellises. I'd fix the irrigation later. In the meantime, I watered the south potato field with a hose and pulled some weeds with my good hand. I cleaned both trout, freezing the big one and cooking the other one. It was good, pan-fried with some hash browns and cheese. But cooking took a lot out of me. I was more tired than I had realized, so I left the dishes in the sink. They were the next day's problem. It was nighttime when I turned in. I eased into the recliner my father had staked out as his territory for 20 years. It still smelled a little like the cigarette smoke that killed him. I put on some music and started to read my Tutankhamun book. I had a TV, but it sat dark and silent most of the time since Papa passed away. He used to watch cable news 24/7 and leave it on even when he wasn't there. The sound of hate filled the house, soaking into the carpet like his cigarette smoke. I opted to read instead. I liked the quiet, the stillness. It was lovely. I'd gotten through a chapter when noises came from the kitchen. I almost didn't hear it over the music. The shush of running water. I was tired, so I wondered if maybe I just left the kitchen sink on and forgot. Didn't notice until it interfered with the music, but then I remembered that I didn't do the dishes. I went for the revolver I kept in the TV room hutch. Both hands on the gun, I pressed against the wall as I advanced with silent footsteps into the kitchen. A figure stood in the kitchen, hands in the sink, humming, "You Are My Sunshine." I recognized that voice. It was impossible. In the kitchen stood my mother. "Mama?" I stammered. The tension dropped out of my arms. I caught my jaw slack and closed it. The figure pulled her hands out of the sink and turned to me. "Hello, dear. You really shouldn't leave dishes in the sink unless they're soaking, especially fish. It'll stick to the pan." It was my mother, without a doubt, Hattie Hall, but her face wasn't right. Her eyes were where her lips should be, her nose sticking out of her cheek, and her mouth cut a vertical scar across the middle of her head. She twitched, too, but it wasn't with her whole body. Her whole essence seemed to flicker, almost like a candle flame in the breeze. With that perpendicular mouth of hers, she offered a sideways grin. "It's good to see you, dear. I was about to make a cup of chamomile after I finished the dishes. Would you like some?" I raised the gun again. "Who are you?" I barked. The smile didn't leave the thing's face. "Why, I'm your mother. Don't you recognize your own mother?" "You're not Mama," I growled. "She's been dead for 4 years. Now the smile faded from her face. She clasped her forearms with her hands, hiding the wounds that still sometimes haunted me. I was the one who'd found her. I'd been the one to clean the bathtub. "Yes," she said, her voice soft and sad. "I know I've been gone a while. I'm sorry." My mind rode the same track it would if she'd been an intruder, because I wasn't entirely sure she wasn't. "Get out of my house." "But dear, it's my house too. And your father's. And your brother's." She stroked the countertop with a tender touch, turning longing eyes to the sink. The wound of a mouth smiled with a little curl of nostalgia. "I miss him. How was he before he left?" I tried to stay strong. "I don't know who you are or what you want, but you need to leave right now." To emphasize, I drew the hammer back on the revolver until it clicked. "Get out." "Do you remember how he would always win at cards? That boy had the best luck. He'd get one rummy after another. "That's because he cheated." Emotions swelled in my breast, and I said it before I could stop myself. I caught my arms lowering again, so I brought them back up to aim the gun at her. With tremendous restraint, voice quaking, I whispered, "He cheated. That's how he won." "You were always so jealous of Ryan," she replied, returning to the sink and turning the faucet back on. The soap suds turned pink as she scrubbed the fish off the pan. "Dear, you've got to get the skillet hotter before you put the fish on. Otherwise, it'll stick like this." "Who are you?" I barked. It was a real question this time, not just a declaration of unfamiliarity. Whatever this thing was, it knew my mother's mannerisms and could imitate her voice. I wanted to know who or what could do such a thing. But her next question made me balk. "Have you met any girls? Any nice girls from town?" Mama used to ask me that question all the time. It was her question. She'd always pestered me about dating and getting married, said I wasn't getting any younger and I wasn't getting any richer. "The only men who find pretty girls in their 40s, she said, have money, Norman, and that's not in the cards for you." I knew that her words came from a good place, but they stung. They were a reminder that this place had a ceiling for me, that I was limited by the box my father had put me in, that I was stuck. "Did you hear me, honey?" my mother asked. She finished the skillet and now was drying it. "I asked if you met any girls." No, Mama, I haven't. You know I don't have time." "You're not getting any younger, Norman. You're not getting any richer either." Ice water flushed my veins. Goosebumps prickled up along my arms. There was no doubt. This wasn't an imitator pretending to be Mama. This was Mama. "What are you doing here?" I asked. She turned to face me, leaning against the sink, hands supporting her against the counter, wrists turned away. She smiled again. "What do you mean, honey?" I mean... I took one hand off the gun and ran my fingers through my hair. I mean, my voice cracked. I mean, you're dead. How can you be here? That misplaced mouth bent into another soft, sweet smile, just like Mama's when I asked a silly question. Why, honey, I never left. I took a step backward. I buried you. I gripped the gun again with both hands. I found you in the bathtub and you were cold as ice. I remember your skin was white like fresh rice and the water was red like strawberries. I pointed the gun at her wrists. You'd cut! But I couldn't finish the sentence. She slipped her hands in her apron pockets. Her wrists left a glistening red snail trail on the white fabric. I loved your father, Norman. I know you two didn't always see eye to eye, but I needed him. You needed him too. That's why this place is such a mess. I take great care of the farm. She tutted and shook her head. Her eyes blinked, but out of sync with one another. This place could really use a woman's touch. I stumbled backward, and my calf bumped against the kitchen table's chair. I sat down and rested the gun on the table. There was never time, Mama. There's so much work to do. You had enough time for those books, she snapped back. You had enough time to read old, dusty books about old, dusty places. You're trying to tell me you didn't have enough time to go out and date? What kind of man are you? Mama, I never wanted... But I didn't finish my sentence. I didn't say the thing I'd wanted to tell her since I was 10. I didn't tell her about how I felt about the farm or the life that had been chosen for me. I didn't tell her why Indiana Jones was my favorite movie or where I went in my dreams. I didn't tell her why my grades were garbage except for history class. She terrified me, and it had nothing to do with the twisted alignment of her features. It had everything to do with the way her eyes would dim and grow misty, and her mouth would pull down at the corners, and it didn't matter how her face was. It would hurt the same because I'd see the disappointment in them. Ryan never saw that disappointment. I never once saw her look at Ryan with those sad, misty eyes and frown against flat, saccharine reassurances. No, Ryan was perfect. Ryan had so many girls sneaking into his bedroom that Papa had to put a lock on it one year. He'd always win, even if it was through ways less than Christ-like. They liked that. A good old country boy. I traced the revolver's handle and stared into space. I may have been the oldest, I said, but Ryan was the favorite, wasn't he? He was a scoundrel, but a harmless scoundrel. The kind of boy you might have fallen in love with when you were a girl. I ran a hand over my face. I was just the test run. Once you and Papa knew I wasn't what you wanted, you figured you knew how you had to tinker your raising to make the boy you wanted to see. I broke my staring contest with the floor to meet my mother's distorted eyes. An all-American rascal. Is that what you wanted? Mama stiffened, straightening up, and after a pause said, I never thought I'd see the day when my own son would talk to me like that. That's the thing, Mama. I don't believe you're here at all. I pointed to the TV room. I believe I'm sitting in that chair, dozing off, and that you're just some awful nightmare I'm struggling with. I bet you dollars to donuts that I'll wake up and the record player's gonna still be going, spinning sheets of static into the air. I sat back into the chair, crossing my arms. I bet you that's what'll happen. Bet you anything. Mama pressed a hand against her cheek and frowned. She stood there in stunned silence for a while, not saying a word until at last she brought that hand off her cheek. Never once did she break her gaze with mine. Mama took a deep breath in "Norman, you're a bad boy." She raised her hand to point an accusatory finger at me. "You're a bad, bad boy, and you know what happens to bad boys." Now it was my turn to stiffen. Mama, don't." She reached into the pocket of her apron and took out a wooden spoon longer than the pocket was deep. It was almost funny, like a clown car, the way it happened, but the promise of what would happen next turned my guts inside out. Mama advanced, brandishing the spoon. I grabbed the gun and shot her. I shot her once in the gut, again in the chest, and a final time in the head above her raised eyebrow. She collapsed backward onto the floor. The gun clattered to my feet. I slid off the chair onto my knees and scuffled toward her, murmuring again and again, "No, Mama, I'm so sorry, Mama, I'm so sorry." When I got to her, Mama's face had changed. The features were all in the right place again. They were all where they were supposed to be. She was my beautiful Mama once more. "What have I done?" I groaned, dropping my haunches back onto my heels and averting my eyes to the ceiling. "What did I do?" I sat like that for a while, unable to cry, but feeling deep down that I ought to. I mustered up the courage to look at the hell I had wrought upon my own mother, but when I brought my gaze back to the floor, she was gone. There was no trace of her body. No blood, no stains, no wooden spoon. Nothing. I whirled around, looking for her, looking for anyone who could explain what had just happened, and I didn't see a soul. Until I entered the TV room. A chill descended upon it at first, and then the lights flickered. I spun around, looking again for some clue as to what was happening. Then, when I turned back around, there stood a monster in the center of the room. It was silhouetted against the floor lamp behind it, but the black form of its outline was enough to stun me into paralyzed silence. The body of a man. Large, folded bat wings. And 3 heads. I don't remember what happened after that. I must have passed out, but I don't remember going to bed. By the time I woke up again, birds chirped outside my window, and the sun filtered through the open blinds. I was still dressed in my clothes from the night before. I groaned, and I turned to my side, facing the nightstand. There lay the locket. It rested on the nightstand at the center of a neat spiral created by its chain. With a slow, unsure hand, I reached out for the locket. The chain hissed as I picked up the jewelry. When I popped it open, inside was not a photograph of my mother, but instead, my father. I dropped the locket like it had been in the oven and scrambled to the other side of the bed. I thought about the night before and raced out of bed. I bolted into the kitchen. On the table lay the revolver. With quaking hands, I opened the cylinder, checked the chambers, and dumped out the bullets. I counted 3 spent shells. I didn't see any bullet holes in the walls around where I remembered shooting the thing that was Mama. The frying pan I cooked the fish on was clean and dry, resting on a rag beside the sink. There was only one conclusion to draw, but I wasn't ready to jump to it yet. I washed my face in the kitchen sink and forewent my morning coffee. The scare had woken me up enough that I didn't need it. Time to get to work. Work would ground me in reality. I found my list from the day before and prioritized it, numbering the chores from most important to least important. Then I put my boots on and went out into the field. I started with the irrigation by the potatoes. I dug up the pipes and replaced the broken section. Then I checked the hops, trellises, and repaired a few. I managed to start weeding before the heat became too much and I had to retreat back into the house. There was so much work to do. Now that Ryan was gone, I'd have to hire someone. It wasn't like he was ever much help, though. I always did the lion's share of the work. He would have taken the job of training the vines and I would have been stuck with the irrigation, the trellises, and the weeds. He would have taken all day to train the vines and then patted himself on the back for a job well done. He'd been so used to the coddling from my parents that he cruised through life on a smile. Tension balled up the muscles in my jaw, and I clenched even harder when I realized I was sneering. Then I remembered the feeling in my gut when he fell off the roof. I remember the flat, wet thud as he hit the ground. I heaved a sigh and shifted my thoughts to the beautiful day. It was good to be outside and bad to think ill of the dead. I let go of the tension and sang a song from one of Papa's old Johnny Cash records. That made me feel better. Dusk came quickly. I was exhausted. I thought about reading, but the weariness seeped into my bones and strained my eyes to the point of discomfort. I made hamburger helper, cracked open a cold cola, and brought my food to the armchair in the living room. I still didn't trust the kitchen. I tried to spend as little time as possible there during the day. My choice of quick meal was not only due to my tiredness. I plopped into the old, smelly armchair and channel surfed until I found a documentary on the pyramids. According to the ancient Egyptians, the dead could interact with the living through their ba. I wondered if something like that had happened the night before. Perhaps Mama's ba had visited me. But the face... she'd been corrupted somehow. Perhaps the afterlife changes us all, and not for the better. I suppose that's any life, though, isn't it? I finished my plate and put it in the dishwasher, keeping my eyes averted to the ground. As I was washing up in the kitchen, I kept my focus on listening to the documentary. The pyramids acted as a mechanism to grant the pharaohs eternal life, transforming them into divine beings. For some reason, I thought about the locket on my nightstand. I thought about the shadowy figure I'd seen the night before. I don't know what connection I'd made, but it was there. Just as the documentary was about to switch to a commercial, it cut off. Cable news took its place. Talking heads argued over the presidential use of executive orders. I never watched the news. I barely even read it. I inched into the living room and found it empty. The remote must have fallen between the chair cushions and bumped a button. But the remote sat on the table beside the lazy boy. I changed the channel and went back to the hutch for my revolver. I'd reloaded it that morning. I was going to find the punk who was messing with me and fill him full of holes. I scoffed at the ridiculousness of my previous notion. Mama's ba hadn't come to me. Some jerk-off wanting to make a name for himself on social media had. "Come out!" I barked. "Come out where I can see you and I'll only call the police. If you make me look for you, I've got a .38 that doesn't like trespassers." I was greeted by silence. Until down the hall to the master bedroom, the floorboards creaked. I raced to the hallway, gun raised, ready to fire. The silhouette of a familiar figure, drawn by the moonlight streaming into my bedroom, stood at the end of the hall. "On your knees!" I roared. From the figure bubbled a distinct snicker. I took a step forward. I fired the gun 3 times. The figure's chuckle heightened to a full laugh.
"You always were a lousy shot."
My jaw dropped, and I took an involuntary step backward. I knew that voice. I knew what impossible figure stood in my hallway. My father emerged from the shadows, stepping into the swath of light from the living room. He looked terrible. Half of his face was black and rotten, with white bone peeking through holes in his flesh. An eye dangled on its nerve from the socket. His hands were riddled with black, gangrenous wounds. Francis Hall shambled into the living room like a slug, casting me an incredulous look with what little face he had left. He plopped into his chair, grabbed the remote, and changed the channel back to the news.
"That's more like it. None of this history crap. Nobody needs to know about a bunch of dead Egyptians. This is real. This is now." Reaching into his breast pocket, he took out a pack of Marlboro Reds and lit up one with the old Zippo he'd had since before I was born. The stink filled the room, bringing to mind a million unpleasant memories. My mother used to work on the house long after my father finished his day, cooking and cleaning. From that chair, with a cigarette between his fingers, he'd bark that his role was to tend the farm and her role was to tend the house. He'd never accounted for how he had Ryan and me to help him. She always worked so hard, and he never gave her credit for the women's work. "Try pulling weeds and tilling soil,"
he'd sneer.
"Then you'll have something to complain about."
Papa took a long drag of his cigarette. Smoke escaped through holes in his cheeks and throat. He leaned back his head and sent a gray plume toward the ceiling. He plucked the cigarette from his lips, moved it over the table beside the chair, and froze. He spun his head to me, eyeball flopping over his face as he scowled.
"Where's the ashtray?"
I got rid of them when you died." Papa stopped his hand on its way to bringing the cigarette back to his mouth. He wheezed a scoff, squeezing his eyes shut and shaking his head in disbelief. The ember crackled as he took a long drag, sucking in his cheeks. Then he exhaled smoke not through his mouth this time, but through the various holes in his head and neck.
"You ought to have known better, boy. You ought to have known that I'd be back to take what's mine."
He leaned over and spit, glaring at me.
"This is exactly the kind of disrespect that I'd expect from you. Never did know how to listen to your elders."
Red rage flashed through my heart like an exploding light bulb. "I did everything for you. I did everything you ever told me to." Papa took another drag of his cigarette.
"Maybe, but you never did it right."
If I never did it right, how am I running the farm now? He scoffed, flicking ash onto the carpet.
Running the farm? Is that what you call it? Your brother ran the farm. You can't keep up with all the work without him.
That's not true. Ryan was a slacker. Papa launched out of the chair and lunged at me.
You watch your mouth, boy.
He pointed at me with his index and middle finger, the cigarette clutched between them.
Your brother got it done, and he got it done right the first time.
Now it was my turn to scoff. That's because I had to fix all of his mistakes. He either got out of work, slacked off, or never finished. I covered for him because I never wanted him to... The words caught in my throat. There was so much resentment for my brother, but recalling why I covered for him against my best interests reminded me of something very, very important. I loved him deeply. Papa put the cigarette back in his mouth and got in my face. The smoke stung my eyes.
Never wanted him to what?
Never wanted him to go through the same things you put me through, Papa. Papa cracked his knuckles and cocked his head, blowing smoke into my face.
And what was that exactly?
My eyes flickered between his hands and his belt. You know what? I don't need to tell you. He took another long drag of the cigarette before dropping the butt into the half-full can of cola by the armchair.
You never did understand why I disciplined you the way I did, but I'll tell you what, it gave you everything you have. Who kicked your ass for doing a crummy job of mixing fertilizer? Who brought you to Jesus after you nailed the trellises like you was blind? The memories swelled up like vomit. I thought about the backhanded slaps, the belt's snap as it collided with my body. I thought about the time he used a length of PVC and laughed at the hollow sound. Papa clicked his tongue. You know who.
He brought a thumb to his chest.
I did. I did that and so much more.
I shook my head. I'm my own man. You may have planted seeds, old man, but you sure as hell didn't water them. Then came the backhand I'd been so familiar with as a boy. It whizzed across my face and hit me softer than I remembered, probably because his flesh was so rotten. But it still hurt, maybe more psychically than physically. I was a little boy again. I staggered backward and gaped at my papa with stunned silence, folding into myself and whimpering. He snickered and shook his head.
Once a little bitch, always a little bitch. You're a disgrace. You call yourself my eldest. You're not even a boy, much less a man.
Papa's belt buckle clattered as he unclasped it. I raised the gun and fired. His head snapped back and he staggered backward toward the armchair. The belt hit the floor. The seconds stretched like chewing gum. It could have been minutes that I waited for his reaction, but I knew it wasn't. At last, he snickered. He brought his head back upright, a huge smile smeared across his face. Through the hole in his forehead, I caught a glimpse of the other side of the room.
You can't kill me, boy. You ain't got it in you.
He lunged. I jumped backward and ran into the kitchen against the sound of his infernal laughter. He chased me and then jumped like he'd never jumped while he was alive, landing his hands against my shoulders and tackling me to the floor. I flailed and tried to fling him off, pulling myself forward with my hands, but all I was able to do was turn around and face him. With alarming speed, he launched himself higher on me and pinned my arms down with his boots while squatting on my chest. He pulled back his fist and rocketed it into my jaw. Then the other. Again. Flesh sloughed off the knuckles, revealing sharp, pointed bones. They tore into my skin. He stopped, straightening up and wrapping his hands around my throat.
Norm, I wish you'd died instead of Ryan. Even though I wasn't around to see it, he's the one who deserves God's fresh air, not you.
Gun in hand, I bent my wrist enough to point it at Dad's torso. I knew the recoil would hurt like hell, but I couldn't breathe. He was really going to do it this time. I'd never, in my adult life, felt so much like I had when I was a boy. I fired the last 3 shots. They wouldn't kill him, but they were enough to set him off balance and give me an opening to push him off. He cried out as he hit the floor, and then I was upon him. It was him or me. I didn't know how to kill him, but I tried like hell. I couldn't use my wrist, so as I pinned him beneath my knees, I switched the gun to my good hand. I held it like a club and slammed the revolver's butt into his face. This time, it was him begging for mercy, crying out, "Stop, stop," over and over again. I didn't reply. I didn't say anything at all. There were no words that couldn't be said with violence. I hit him until he stopped babbling. Then I hit him until he stopped flailing. I hit him until the revolver's grip broke and sweat dripped down my face. Papa's head was a greasy smear of blood and broken bone on the tile floor. My shoulders heaved. I winced against the pain in my wrist as I ran my fingers through my soaked hair. I let the gun slip through my fingers. It clattered to the floor. I felt so much better. The rage, pent up for decades but now released, had been too much. The overwhelming pain rushed out of me. I sat on the second-time corpse of my father and wept. They weren't tears of joy or sadness. They were tears of relief. It was finally over. I could rest now. My tears were interrupted by a soft, wordless rasp. A chill overtook the room. The shadows seemed to darken and grow. They stretched from beneath the cabinets and from the legs of the table I had eaten at since I was a boy. I whirled my head around, first at the window above the sink, and then to the door to the garage, but there was nothing. My heart knew what my mind refused to accept. It was behind me. The being had always been behind me, ready to grant me release. But I hadn't been ready until I'd found the locket. I rolled off Papa's rotten corpse and turned, facing the doorway to the living room. Framed by the threshold stood the being. It filled the frame, even against the kitchen light. It remained shrouded by darkness. What are you? But it wouldn't answer. Even if it did, I wouldn't be able to comprehend its ancient tongue. Before me stood a being beyond my comprehension. Arms crossed, it stretched its wings slightly and seemed to nod its center head. With shock, I realized it understood my thoughts. Without another word or motion of acknowledgement, the being disintegrated into the darkness from head to foot, a slow evaporation into the night. Exhaustion shuddered through me. I didn't have the strength to process what I'd just experienced. I would deal with it in the daylight. I went to sleep and slept my best night in years. The next day, I got to work right after breakfast and coffee. I finished the irrigation, trained the vines I needed to get to, and even had enough time to fix a few trellises. I cooked the fish I'd frozen, baked with lemon, some potatoes, and green beans on the side, and enjoyed the evening with old records and my Tutankhamun book. It was a good day. I showered before getting ready for bed, and that's when I noticed the locket. It was around my neck. That meant it had to have been there all day. But that was impossible. I cringed at the notion of even wearing a wedding ring, much less a locket. I kept it on my bedside table, not on my person. Besides, it had to be finished. I defeated the biggest evil in my life. What more could the locket have to teach me? I opened it. Inside was a picture of my brother, Ryan. I'd told him to be careful. I'd told him to stop, but he didn't listen. I snapped the locket shut and flung it across the bathroom as if it had transformed into a cockroach. It disgusted me just the same. I never wanted to see it again. I damned the day I'd found that locket and prayed its promise wouldn't come to pass. I couldn't see Ryan again. He was gone, and that was enough. A dream. It was all a dream. I was grief-stricken, and that was causing nightmares. None of the things I'd experienced the past 2 nights had happened. It was all a dream. I slipped into bed, weary from work and weary with dread. All I wanted was for sleep to overtake me and send me somewhere safe. I fell asleep almost as soon as my head hit the pillow. But it was only a few hours before noises woke me up. First, it was banging, loud and violent, but the longer I listened, the more I heard dragging sounds, too, interspersed between the crashing and clattering. Someone was upstairs. It felt more real this time, as opposed to the dreams of the previous 2 nights. I felt like the boy who cried wolf. I'd wasted my revolver on hallucinations, and now something real had happened. Someone must have snuck in through the window upstairs and was ransacking the place. I bolted out of bed, leaving my pajamas on, and stumbled up the stairs with the baseball bat I kept beside my bed. The room was trashed. My brother's dresser had been knocked over, the sheets torn off the bed and strewn about the room. The mattress was up against the wall and his old CDs were scattered around. On the wall was carved the sentence, "I'm still better." I ran a hand over the letters. They'd been cut deep into the drywall. Probably with a knife. An image of Ryan and I fishing on the riverbank flashed through my mind. His fishing knife was huge, engraved with his name on the cheek of the blade. It was a special present from our parents on his 16th birthday. He carried it with him everywhere, only taking it off to sleep. When he died, it was one of the effects that the coroners gave me with a pile of his clothes. Of course, any knife could have made these marks. But I was certain it was that one. I'd put it on top of the dresser when I'd put away that old blood-stained shirt and jeans, but the knife wasn't there now. Instead, there was a small carving in the wood where the knife had been. I recognized it as the pattern on the locket. Thunder rolled in the distance, but the sound wasn't muffled behind glass. The sweet, earthy scent of rain swelled in the room, and its tattoo rapped against the roof and windows. Ryan's bedroom was at the top of the house, and it had dormer windows that led out onto the roof. He and I always exited through his bedroom window to get onto the roof. The window was open. The light rain soaked the billowing curtains and the pillow at the head of his still unmade bed. A skeletal hand of lightning, stretching almost all the way to the ground, tore the black sky apart. I half expected it to illuminate the three-headed being, but it showed me nothing. Just the window. Just the roof. I backed away from it, shaking my head. I turned to leave the bedroom, but the door slammed in my face, nearly catching my fingers. "No, I won't go!" Darkness swirled in the corner of the room beside the door. I turned my back on it to grab the handle and shake it, but the door wouldn't budge. I slammed my shoulder against the wood, but to no avail. It was stuck. The darkness swirled into dense tendrils. They twisted together and merged, creating a form I was familiar with now. The three-headed being with the large wings. I swung the bat, missing once, twice, but connecting the third time. The bat phased through the being's body like smoke. It caught the bat at the end of its swing with its black, sludgy hand, reared back its three heads, and roared with rage. It wrenched the bat out of my hands, snapped it in half, and then crushed each half in its claws like it was styrofoam. I cried out and scrambled away toward the bed. The being extended its wings as if stretching them in preparation and flexed its claws. I took a step forward. I looked at the window. I looked at the being. I only had two choices. I ducked out the window. The wet shingles were slicker than I imagined, and I nearly lost my footing coming out of Ryan's bedroom. I cast a glance back inside the house, hoping to some small degree that perhaps the being had disappeared, that maybe it was just the shadows in my addled brain, but it was only wishful thinking, of course. The creature stood in Ryan's room, hovering beside his bed, claws extended from its hand. It pointed, directing me to a spot on the roof that I knew all too well. A place I wish had lost its significance. For a moment, I thought facing the creature was preferable to facing my brother. It could crush me like it had the baseball bat, and I could be through with this nightmare. 31 years of resentment and a week of guilt. The guilt was worse. It weighed on my heart like heavy black chains, dragging me into the earth, deeper than a seed in the soil, all the way down to hell. I'd lived in hell since Ryan died. I looked up the slope of the roof. Lightning flashed above the peak of the house, illuminating a figure, waiting for me. On my hands and knees for extra support, I crawled up the roof to meet him. The rain grew heavier, as if excited. I could make out Ryan's jeans, a plaid shirt, and messy hair, the same clothes he'd worn when he died. He was turned away from me, and another bolt of lightning revealed the back of his head, mottled and smashed from the rock he'd landed on last week. The jagged edges of bone surrounding the caved-in skull reminded me of a shark's mouth open wide, ready to swallow prey. And that's what I felt like. This felt like a trap. No, I murmured to myself. I won't. I moved to turn around and crawl back down the rain-slick half of the slanted roof, but at the edge crouched the being. Now its wings were spread wide, and I could make out the definition of its muscles. Its 3 human heads bared hideous lion's teeth, and it snarled. I looked back at the figure on top of the roof and swallowed. I nodded to myself. I vanquished my mother and my father. I could vanquish my brother too. But did I want to? Did he deserve it? Ryan turned around and extended his arms wide. "This was all mine," he bellowed, "and you took it from me." Rage burned in my stomach. I could do it. Unsteady but maintaining dignity, I stood upright. I wouldn't do this on my knees. I would do it on my own 2 feet. "It was mine before you came along," I shouted over the rain. "Mama and Papa were too. You took everything from me and you don't deserve a scrap." Ryan laughed. "I earned it by being their favorite." He unsheathed the knife on his hip and ran his finger over the engraved calligraphy. "I'm the best, Normie. It doesn't get better than this." Pointing the knife at me, he raised his chin and snarled, "You couldn't handle that." I stepped forward, trying to focus on my feet against the shingle's slick surface. It was challenging because I wanted to run up to Ryan and deck him in the nose. I wanted to rip the smile off his face and shatter it into a million pieces. I wanted to push him off the roof again. "Deja vu, huh, brother?" He shrugged and shook his head. "Is that how you're gonna solve all your problems? When you can't win, you're gonna throw a tantrum? You're a parasite! You cheated at cards and you cheated at life. You conned me into cleaning up after you and then took all the credit. If Papa had known what kind of a person you were, he would have kicked you out." Ryan laughed again, crouching down to meet my eyes. "No, he wouldn't, brother." His voice was low. I could barely hear it over the rain. "He would have loved me just the same. See, I had a different relationship with them than you. I could have shit in their turkey and they would have called it stuffing. You didn't even love them. You didn't even love me. I took your beatings. I took your share of the pain. What did I get for it? Nothing." Ryan rubbed his jaw, a wicked grin cutting across his handsome face. "Did you ever consider, Norm, that they weren't worthy of your love?" He brought the tip of the knife against my cheek, tracing my jaw. "I did, and I considered they were sons of bitches." Roaring again, I leaped at him, all the fear burned away by the hate, its ashes washed away by the rain. The knife flew into the air. Our bodies collided with each other and he fell backward. I thought I'd pushed him all the way off the roof again, but his body stopped before it toppled over the peak. The spearhead of the Weather Vane stuck out of his chest, bloody and coated with gore that the rain was already washing away. Ryan lashed out his foot. It caught my knee, and I stumbled back and lost my balance. I collapsed onto the roof. I rolled toward the edge. I fell. But I grabbed the ledge, gripping for my life. I thought about how Ryan must have felt when I pushed him off. I wondered if the suddenness had reduced or enhanced his fear. I'd never know. I'd killed him twice. Except I hadn't. As I tried to pull myself back onto the roof, I saw my brother move on the weather vane. He turned his body on the spike, placed his hands underneath himself, and pushed himself off the rod. He shook his head. "No, Normie, not again." He approached. I pulled harder and was able to get up to my waist when he was upon me. He sent a kick into my jaw that made my teeth clack in my skull, and I fell again, still clutching the awning for dear life. Ryan crouched low and brought his face close to mine. "Your turn, Norman." He put his hand on my face and then pushed. I fell. It was about a 20-foot drop. It only took a second or two to hit the ground, but it felt like an eternity. I spent a lifetime in freefall, gazing into Ryan's face as he laughed. Then came the pain. I hit the ground on my heels, and the shock ran up my calves, burning my knees before it shot through my thighs. Then I fell again, backward, and a sharp pain shot through my back when I hit the ground. A rock. I must have landed on a rock. The same rock Ryan had landed on. He was the last thing I saw before passing out. He stood at the edge of the roof, his arms at his side, looking down on me. Ryan would always look down on me. The fall had paralyzed me from the waist down. I'd managed to call an ambulance with my cell phone when I woke up, but I could do little more than babble to them. More than the physical injuries, my shock came from the realization that I couldn't work the fields. My family's legacy was dead. Maybe that's better. Maybe my father never deserved to be brought into this world. Maybe my mother never deserved to marry him. His influence on her was evident throughout my life. I still have sweet memories of her. She didn't always brandish the spoon. My father, however, had always balled his fist and wielded the belt. So, maybe not all legacies deserve to survive. Maybe some ought to be buried stillborn. Ryan didn't deserve the end he got. I realize that now. He worked within a rigged system. I was always resentful that I'd tried playing the game and still lost. Truth of the matter is, there weren't any winners in the Hall household. I was born into a race to hell. It didn't take long to sell the farm. We had a good reputation, and we'd taken good care of it for a long, long time. The soil was fertile, and the plants were happy. They'd maybe been the only happy things in that place. I got a job at the bookstore, and things have never been better. I specialize in the history section, but working there has opened up new worlds for me. I can't remember the last time I read fiction, if ever, but I've discovered its quiet escape and its gentle education. I work for Jessica now, but we've been hanging out more. There might be something there, something I'd never given space to before. Things are good. I'm happy. I'm rid of my demons and free from the entity. Or so I thought. On one of my days off, I was reading a fantasy book about an ancient war, listening to a new record I'd picked up when the music stopped in mid-song. I rolled my wheelchair over to the record player, assuming I just needed to fix the needle. In the hallway stood a figure. The air rushed out of my lungs as my blood froze. The three-headed being stood in the shadows, ensconced by them like clothing. But it extended a hand to the light. I'd expected something grotesque or monstrous, but it was just a hand. Long-fingered and elegant, maybe even beautiful. It wanted the locket. It didn't have to speak for me to know. It wanted its locket back. It had more lessons to teach. It had more pain to release. The being wouldn't hurt me, but still I trembled in fear. I took the locket off from around my neck and placed it in the being's outstretched hand. As the chain fell from my hand, it coiled around the locket like a snake readying itself for sleep. Indeed, it would sleep. Perhaps a day, perhaps a millennium. But it would find its next student one day, perhaps in the belly of a fish or perhaps in a mysterious package. The being had more work to do. It had more insight to impart. But as for me, I'm free. Thank you for sharing my nightmares and helping me carry the grief. If you enjoy the show, please share your favorite nightmare with a friend or family member. Don't forget to leave a rating. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you'd like to go the extra mile, you can join my Patreon for $3 a month and you can cancel at any time. Or you can buy my book on Amazon. I've put links to both in the description. I'd love to connect with you on Instagram, Facebook, or Threads. Just look for Nightmares and Grief and you'll find me. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Good night.